Well, hello, and I'm very happy to be here, of course. I think every happiness conference should be near a Ferris wheel and a merry-go-round. I mean, how fabulous is that? So I'm going to talk today about how I got the idea to do a happiness project. And I'm going to talk about 3 threshold questions about the nature of happiness that I felt that I had to tackle for myself, and I'm sure you've thought about for yourself. And then I'm going to throw out a bunch of manageable, concrete resolutions and habits for you to think about if you're going to start your happiness project. Just like little things that you could start tomorrow morning. And do not worry, these are things that don't take a lot of time, energy, or money, because nobody's got a lot of extra time, energy, or money. Now, I got the idea to do a happiness project in a very inconspicuous moment of my life. I was on a city bus, stuck in the pouring rain, and I had one of those rare opportunities for reflection that we don't often get in the hubbub of everyday life. And I looked out the window and I thought, what do I want from life anyway? And I thought, well, I want to be happy. I realized that I didn't spend any time thinking about whether I was happy or if I could be happier. I should have a happiness project, I decided. As soon as I have some free time, I'm going to do that. And then I realized I never have any free time. If I wanted to become happier, I had to make the time. So I went out the next day to the library and got a giant stack of books about happiness. I wanted to know what were the great minds and scientists saying about happiness, and could I figure out a way to make myself happier? And so I decided I was going to take a year and each month address a different theme in my life and try to come up with manageable, concrete things that I could do to boost my happiness. And I also wanted to do it within the normal confines of my ordinary day, because I love hearing about other people's radical happiness projects. You know, like Elizabeth Gilbert moving to all those exotic countries, or the guy that gave up the internet for a year. But I wanted to just do something within my ordinary day. I wanted to change my life without changing my life. But there were 3 threshold questions about happiness that I felt that I had to address. And the first is, well, what is happiness anyway? It turns out that happiness is a very elusive concept. There are something like 15 academic definitions of happiness. And I decided that for the average person like me, the looseness of the concept of happiness was actually good, because it meant we could all have different ideas. It could be contentment or satisfaction or bliss or peace or joy or contentment. The word happiness was big enough to contain all these ideas. And I also concluded that I think it's really better to think about being happier, because the word happiness suggests sort of this magical utopia, this finish line. Can you cross it? How do you know if you're there? How do you stay there? What does it look like? But happier, this is like, are you moving in the right direction? This week, next month, next year, what could I do to be happier? It feels more realistic. So then the question is, okay, well, can you make yourself happier? And I think it's helpful to think about a set range for happiness. Because research suggests that about 50% of happiness is genetically determined. Some people are born Tiggers, and some people are born Eeyores, and to some extent that's hardwired. We all see that in everyday life. Then about 10 to 20% is something called life circumstances, and that's things like age, health, education, occupation, marital status. Then all the rest is very much influenced by the way that we think and the way that we act. And that's where a happiness project can come in. So your range might be 7 to 10, or it might be 5 to 8. But we can all do things that are going to push us up to the top of our natural range. But the third question about happiness is a much more profound question. And that's the question of whether it's selfish to want to be happier. Happiness has a surprisingly bad reputation. Some people think that if people who want to be happier are selfish, or self-indulgent, or smug, or superficial, or complacent. But in fact, research shows, and I think if you think about the people in your own life, you'll see this borne out in your own experience, that happy people are more interested in the problems of the people around them, and they're more interested in the problems of the world. They're more altruistic. They give away more money, they volunteer more time, they're more likely to help out if a family member or a colleague or a friend needs a hand. They make better team members and better leaders. they're healthier, and they have better habits. When we're happy, we have the emotional wherewithal to turn outward and to think about other people and about the problems of the world. When we're unhappy, it's very easy to become defensive and isolated and preoccupied with our own problems. So if it is selfish to be happier, we should be selfish, if only for selfless reasons. It turns out that when people are happier, they just naturally want to turn outward and help other people. And so one of the best ways to help other people is to be happy yourself. So then where do you start? Okay, you want to be happier, you want to get going, but I don't know about you, but when I started thinking about this, happiness, it was abstract, it was transcendent, everything felt tangled up with everything else. So where do you start? You want to do something tomorrow morning. What would you do first? I would suggest that a good place to start is with energy, with vitality, because energy is very tied to our emotions. And also, when we have more energy, it's easier to do the things that we know will make us happier, that are going to take a little time and effort. For instance, you might say to yourself, well, I know I would be happier if I did that volunteer job, but I'm just so drained and overwhelmed, I can't face it. I just can't do it. And so having more energy makes it possible to do all the other things that are going to make us happier. So what do you do for energy? Now, the first thing I'm going to suggest is a habit you should follow in order to boost your happiness is so basic that you will laugh, but I think that it needs to be said. To be happier, you really need to get enough sleep. Most adults need at least 7 hours of sleep. How many people here regularly get 7 hours of sleep? Okay, that is not everybody. How many people here regularly use a snooze alarm? That instrument of torture. It's important to get enough sleep. It sounds little, but it's big. The thing that's funny about sleep deprivation is that we adjust to it, and we don't realize how affected we are. And you'll talk to people who say, well, I've trained myself to get by in 4 hours. But when scientists study these people, they're quite impaired. Lack of sleep affects mood, memory, immune function. It's hard to turn out the light, but it's very important to get enough sleep and to have that foundation. And by the same token, it's very important to get some exercise. You don't need to train for the marathon, but just moving around, going for a 15-minute walk, it's going to do a lot to boost your energy and your mood. Some people think that they're too tired to exercise, but actually exercise tends to boost energy instead of depleting energy, unless you're really exercising at the far reaches. So feeling tired is a reason to exercise, not a reason to skip exercising. And if you're a person who has trouble sleeping, it's going to help you fall asleep faster and sleep more deeply. But here is a secret tip. Let's say it's Wednesday afternoon and you're dragging. You don't have time to take a nap. You can't go for a walk outside. What can you do for a quick jolt of energy and good cheer? All you do is jump up and down, especially if people can see you, like I just did, because you will feel very goofy. There's something about getting both feet off the ground. If you do jumping jacks by your desk, if you run down the stairs, if you leap over a puddle, there's something, it's childlike, it's energetic, it's going to give you a jolt of cheer. So these are things that have to do with physical energy. But we also need mental energy. What do you do for mental energy? So one of the things that's interesting that comes out of the research is that often we think that we act because of the way we feel. But to a great extent, we feel because of the way we act. And so by changing our actions, which we can consciously do, we're going to influence our emotional state. So by doing things, actions, we can make ourselves feel happier. And one of the habits that I love to follow is to sing in the morning. This is something that takes no time, energy, or money. And it's not important to be good at singing. I'm a terrible singer, as my children will often remind me. But there's something about singing in the morning. You're signaling to yourself that you're full of good cheer and energy, you're starting your day right, and it puts you into that emotional state. And that increases your energy and lifts your mood. And here's something that I found to be very counterintuitive, but is absolutely true. So one of the things about happiness is that novelty and challenge tend to make people happier. If we do something new, even something as simple as going to a new restaurant, it tends to boost our happiness. And sometimes when you're feeling overwhelmed and drained and low energy, the impulse is to lighten your load. It's to get rid of things. It's to drop responsibilities. It's to say, I have to do less because I'm overwhelmed. Sometimes that's the right thing to do. But counterintuitively, sometimes the better thing to do is just the opposite, and to give yourself more challenges, to do something new and novel and difficult and demand more of yourself. And I had this experience recently because I was feeling overwhelmed. I was feeling at the very outer limits of my strength. And I had an opportunity to start a podcast with my sister. And I thought, I can't do it. It's like all these new responsibilities, all this terminology, all these the stuff to keep track of, people to meet, places to go. Oh, it's too much. And then I remembered, novelty and challenge bring happiness. Maybe I'll get more energy by doing more than doing less. And indeed, that's what I found. So sometimes by demanding more of ourselves, we get that energy, that burst of energy that comes from meeting a novel and challenging assignment. So that's energy. So what next where else would you turn? Now, the next area I want to talk about, it's not the most significant thing you could do to work on your own happiness, but it's something that I think is often overlooked in discussions of happiness. And that is the role of possessions. Now, it's controversial even to say that possessions matter at all, because some people argue possessions don't matter, stuff doesn't matter, get rid of everything, you'll be happier if it's all gone. Thoreau said, simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. Now, you might say it would have been simpler to just say one, simplicity, but we get the point. But I think that for most people, possessions do have an important role to play in a happy life. They allow us to project our identity into our environments, and they serve as important reminders of the people and the places and the activities that we love. So one of the things I wanted to do for my happiness project was to get more happiness from the possessions I had. And I decided to make the resolution to cultivate a shrine. And by shrine, I mean a place of super engagement. Now, it turns out that one of the things that's sort of idiosyncratically true about me, about Gretchen, is that I am this crazy fan of children's literature and young adult literature. I love it. So I went around my house, gathered up all my children's literature books, I cleared off a bookcase, arranged them nicely, along with some of my mementos of children's literature, like the Gryffindor banner that a friend brought me from the Harry Potter theme park, and I put them all together, and it makes me so happy. It's not that I own anything that I didn't own before, but by taking the time to mindfully arrange these objects, to put them together in a loving way, it dramatically increased my sense of engagement with them. And so now whenever I go to that part of my home, I'm so happy. Now, another thing about the relationship between possessions and happiness, and I gotta say, this is something that really surprised me. It doesn't really make sense, and I've been thinking about it for years, but I feel it and other people seem to feel it too. It's disproportionate, but there it is. And that is the degree to which for most people, not everyone, but for most people, outer order contributes to inner calm. More than it should, because we can all agree that in the context of a happy life, something like a crowded coat closet or an overflowing desk is trivial, clearly. And yet over and over, I've experienced, and people tell me that they feel the same way, that there's something about getting control of the stuff of life that makes you feel more in control of your life generally. And if it's an illusion, it's a helpful illusion. And of everything that I've talked to people about, every habit, every resolution that they followed, there's one thing that has come up the most often. And I'm not saying this is the most significant thing you could do for your happiness, but it is the thing that people most often mention. And that is the habit to make your bed. How many people here regularly make their bed? How many people here regularly make their bed in a hotel room on the morning they check out? Yes? Okay, well, we'll talk later. There is something about this little action. A Navy SEAL, head of the Navy SEALs gave a talk about the importance of making your bed. Little action, you do it every day, that just makes you feel more like you're starting your day right. It gives you that boost of happiness, cheer, feeling of being in control of yourself. And these little actions matter more than you would think. I mean, I remember a friend of mine said, I finally cleaned out my fridge, and now I know I can switch careers. And I knew exactly how that felt. But the thing about outer order is that it takes constant effort, because there's stuff is always happening. So how do you stay on top of it? So one habit that I found to be extremely helpful is the 1-minute rule. And that's that anything I can do in less than a minute, I do without delay. If I can hang up a coat on a hook, if I can scan a letter and toss it. And that keeps the scum of clutter from accumulating on the surface of life. Because often we feel surrounded by all these little tasks that are inconsequential on their own, but together they make us feel burdened and weighed down. And there's just strangely something about getting rid of these little challenges that then makes us feel like we can tackle a big challenge. It lifts our spirits. It makes us feel more creative, more energetic, more capable of tackling big challenges by taking care of these little matters of order. Okay, well, we talk about energy, we talk about possessions, but what if somebody said, what is the key to happiness? What is the key? What's the secret to happiness? I think you can answer that question in a couple different ways, depending on what framework you use to think about happiness. I think one really good answer to that is self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is key to happiness. We can build a happy life only on the foundation of our own nature, our own values, our own interests. But another way to answer that question, and maybe the best way to answer that question, is relationships. Ancient philosophers and contemporary scientists agree that to be happy, we need enduring, intimate bonds with other people. We need to be able to confide. We need to feel like we belong. We need to be able to get support, and just as important for happiness, we need to be able to give support. So anytime we're trying to think about how to spend our time, energy, or money, something that broadens relationships or deepens relationships is something that's going to make us happier. So what might you do? What are some simple, manageable, concrete things to do to strengthen your relationships? The fact is, we all know there's no substitute for face-to-face. In the end, you got to go face-to-face. That's the most powerful way to have a relationship. But it's hard. People are busy. It takes time and energy to pull it off. So what can you do? I have become a big fan of joining or starting a group as a way to foster relationships. Now, it sounds a little funny to talk about efficiency and friendship, but the fact is, being in a group is a very efficient way to have face-to-face contact with a lot of people. And the way groups work is often, I'll bring some of my friends, and you bring some of your friends, and so I make friends with your friends, and you meet my friends, and now we're all part of a social network. And that's good. And if I miss one meeting, well, then I'll see everybody next time. That's okay. We don't have to make a lot of individual plans because we're meeting as a group. Usually groups form around something that everybody's interested in. I just heard about an interesting group, a bunch of guys, they read famous New Yorker profiles as their activity. What a great idea for a group. And another thing that's very powerful about groups is that often people who are trying to become happier or to work on things in their lives are very benefited by some form of accountability. And groups provide accountability. They provide fun, they provide relationships, ideas, but they can also, for people are doing happiness project groups together or habit change groups together, they get that crucial accountability from that face-to-face contact with other people. So that's a wonderful way to deepen your relationships. But then what about more long-distance relationships? Now, one of the questions that a lot of people are really interested in the field of happiness is, how is technology affecting our happiness? What's it doing? There's a lot of research in that area. My own view is that technology is a good servant, but a bad master. And it can do a lot of wonderful things for us, but like any medicine, it can turn to poison. And so we have to use it wisely so that it's helping us and being an aid in our happiness and not getting in our way. So just recently, my family started a new habit. Was my mother's idea. So my sister and I were home for our high school reunions with my parents, and my mother made an observation that a lot of people have made, which is it's kind of funny the way if you see somebody all the time, you've got a million things to tell them, and if you see somebody like once every 6 months, they're like, what's going on? Oh, not much. What's new with you? Oh, nothing. And you got nothing to say. And so my mother said, we need to keep more up to date with just the little details of what's going on. So let's send each other emails every few days. We immediately realized this was a brilliant idea, and so now we do that. And every several days, one of us will send an email called Update. This is what we call it, Update. And it will be filled with minutia. Like my mother sent me one yesterday that had to do with their air conditioner repairman coming. Because by the way, the motto of Update is, it's okay to be boring. And there's no expectation that you reply. So when I get an update, it's not like I think, oh gosh, now I've got to answer. There's no expectation to answer. What I found is that just by using a quick email and sending it out every several days, I have dramatically deepened my sense of engagement with these family members, who are some of the most, the most important relationships in my life, because I know the little things that are going on with them. And so I feel very tied to them. And the final point I want to make, and this is about a relationship in your imagination, essentially. So we talked about relationships with people that you're face-to-face with and with people that you're more distant from. But this is a resolution about someone in your mind. And it's one of my very favorite Happiness Project resolutions. And that is to imitate a spiritual master. So what does this mean? So to imitate a spiritual master, first you have to choose your spiritual master, which is an enormously creative, interesting, thought-provoking exercise. There's a million people from whom to choose. You could pick a great figure from history, a religious leader, a literary figure, somebody that you actually know. And back to the idea that self-knowledge brings happiness, you learn a lot about yourself from when you think about the person that you pick. Because there's a reason that you were attracted to that person as your spiritual master. What does it tell you about yourself? So you've picked a spiritual master, and then you have to learn about the spiritual master. What does the spiritual master stand for? What are their teachings? So you could read books, you could read their writings, you could watch documentaries, you could talk to them if it's somebody that you know. You have to learn what they stand for. And then the really interesting creative part, and this is where the relationship comes into your mind, is that you have to think about, well, how would you translate what your spiritual master is teaching into your own life? Because for most of us, our circumstances are very different from the circumstances of our spiritual master. Now, for me, as it happens, my spiritual master is Saint Therese of Lisieux. Now, Saint Therese and I have nothing in common. So she was French. She was born in 1873. She died at the age of 24 from tuberculosis after having spent much of her life in a cloistered convent with like 20 other nuns. She's not just a saint, she's a super saint. She's a doctor of the church. So we have nothing in common, and yet when I read her memoir, Story of a Soul, I instantly identified with her as my spiritual master. And I think about her all the time and trying to understand how to translate what she's saying and teaching into my own life. How do I transmit that? For instance, one of the things that's true about me is that I'm kind of a bean counter. I'm a scorekeeper. You did this for me, now I have to do this for you, but now it's your turn to do something else for me, especially with my husband. But I think of what Saint Therese said: when one loves, one does not calculate. And so I remind myself, no calculation. That's what my spiritual master has to say to me. And I think that this process, first of identifying a spiritual master, learning what the spiritual master stands for, and then translating it into our own lives, is enormously thought-provoking and powerful. Because this relationship that you have with someone in your mind can be just as significant as the relationships of the people that you have in your everyday life. So the final point that I would have to make, that I want to make, is that now, having done this and thought about happiness for years, I really do think that just about anyone can benefit from doing this kind of thing. Maybe not to the extreme degree that I did for a year and resolution after resolution after resolution. Sort of like I tried all those things, so you don't have to. But I do think that just about anyone can benefit from taking the time to step back from life, to mindfully think about how to have more love, more engagement, more tenderness, more service, and how to have less anger, less guilt, less resentment, less boredom, and how to have a life that feels right, where we're living up to our values, where we're following through on the things that are important to us, the things that we feel like are true priorities, when we make time for transcendent values to be present in our everyday life. Because I think that taking the time to do that and figuring out the specific concrete ways to translate those values into everyday action really is something that can make us happier. It certainly made me happier. So thank you very much.